Thanks a lot, Mia, and thanks for coming and for your interest in how a business actually can be interested in not only mitigation but actually climate change adaptation. Just a little bit of background of Cafédirect, the company I'm working with. As I said, it's a social enterprise, and I don't know, how many of everyone is familiar about the concept of social enterprise. In essence, it's about doing business differently, not just looking into the bottom line of financials, the P&L, but actually how, as a business, you can drive change and you can have environmental and social impact next to the financial outcome as well. And that's clearly in our DNA. We were set up in 1991, and from our mission, you can clearly see that that social impact is at the forefront, because as a company, we work with smallholder coffee, tea, and cocoa farmers in around 13 countries worldwide. So we source their products, but not just only do we source their products, but they're actually a vital stakeholder in the company because they are a shareholder of Cafédirect as well. So they own a consumer brand, and that makes, I think, the big difference in terms of what the business model is all about and how we can achieve actually environmental and social impact next to the financial one. So that's a little bit the context, and that's probably then important to understand the rest of my presentation about that specific case studies. But I think it's an interesting business model to look into, and that's why I also propose then later this afternoon to explore that whole arena of sustainable business models even further, because I do think that that's a very important topic. So why? We all know about the challenge. Why did Cafédirect actually look into the topic of climate change and climate change adaptation? Well, we all know what's happening out there in developing countries specifically. So you have rising temperatures, you have weather patterns that are changing constantly in these countries, meaning more prolonged drought periods or very, very, very substantial and heavy rainfall patterns that, of course, immediately affect and impact upon the agricultural sector, upon the rural communities we work with. So, from that scenario, from that changing patterns, you have then next to it, an immediate impact on the crops of the farmer. So you have higher pest incidents, you have a very negative impact on the yield, because, for example, in coffee, which is a yearly crop, so it starts with the flowering process, and if because of changing rainfall pattern, your flowering process is interrupted or is disturbed, well, it has an immediate effect of what 9 months later or 8 months later you're actually going to harvest. So for our smallholder farmers, these changes are already a reality. It's not something in a distant future that we just theoretically can discuss, but actually it's happening now as we speak. Third element there, I think, in terms of impact, is on soil fertility. Again, very much driven by changing weather patterns, and then, of course, changing weather patterns inducing farmers to go into less sustainable agricultural practices, because they think by, for example, putting more fertilizer on, they can, level out the yield issue. But of course, it's just again a short-term solution, because the overlying problem is not addressed. And so you have a really sort of a quite dynamic and a quite toxic then situation for your farmers and their communities, which then affects, of course, and here comes the business, their crops, and not just the yield or the availability of their crops, and in our case, they are export crops, as I said, cocoa, tea, and coffee, but also the quality. And so, which of course for a business and for a farmer then in terms of the price he or she will fetch for that product, will be affected immediately, and you get not only lower yield, so you can sell less, but actually all of a sudden you might also get a lower price because the quality of your product or the impacts I mentioned is not up to what even a social enterprise like Cafédirect can actually expect or needs to expect. So this scenario, this underlying then challenge, was led us to what we're going to do about that in conjunctions with the rural communities, with the smallholders. So we really looked into what's the compelling actually business case to go into adaptation. I think the first starting point was, well, every company looks into mitigation, of course, because there's legislation, there are standards, there's pressure from different policy bodies to literally do your homework in terms of reducing your carbon footprint and going to more sustainable business practices. But we thought, well, actually, there are two sides to the coin of climate change. So whilst on one side you have to do, kind of mitigation as a business, on the other side, clearly there's the adaptation case, which for us was upfront because we work with an agricultural commodity chain and with smallholder farmers that are already affected by climate change. So the adaptation part for us was from the start actually woven into the business case as the other side of the coin and not something completely different. Second, then, well, yes, supply chain availability of raw materials. We did research in different regions. For example, here in northern Peru, around 9 of our coffee producer partners are located. And clearly, you can see from the suitability change, and this is a scenario for 2050, that, there are areas where, the dark blue areas, where in 40 years' time, your suitability to grow coffee, will be dropped by more than 50%, where it will not be sustainable to grow coffee at a quality that, nowadays you need for the product. And that, of course, then leads to, so where as a business will we get high quality tea, coffee, cocoa in the future around the sustainable supply chain approach? And I will come back to that slide a little bit later. So what you're going to do with that kind of information? Do we move just next door to Ecuador or Colombia because they are able then in 40 years' time to produce better coffee, or what? So I think supply chain definitely is part of the business case, but not enough. I think as an ethical company, as a social enterprise, we are always very interested to link the producer side with the consumer side. Because that's what, in the end, it's about. It's less about the product, it's more about the people behind the product on both sides. And so I think consumers nowadays, especially in countries like the UK, Europe, America, are more and more interested about what's happening, where their product is coming from, and what's behind that product. And so that engagement with consumers is absolute, vital to also drive, awareness around the issue of climate change and what's happening at, thousands of miles away in Africa, in a rural community around tea or coffee, and how you connect that to the end consumer. Fourth point, well, the famous triple bottom line, as I mentioned, for us to really engage about climate change in a different way, well, is down to our DNA of not just seeing the bottom line of the financials, but actually, well, how can we achieve more environmental and social impact at the same time? And so it was sort of natural to do something about that and, you know, weave it into the business case. And finally, which I think we should never forget, I mean, even if it looks quite dire and it looks absolutely, enormous in terms of task, in terms of challenge around climate change adaptation, there is also opportunity in that. In the end, linking farmers to the market, if it's now around coffee or cocoa product, but in the future it might be around a different kind of agricultural product that these communities are able to produce. So why not? And you take, again, within the business model, the communities with you instead of just moving on and, as I said, purchase your coffee next door from a different country where they still can produce high quality coffee. So I think the opportunity aspect should never be underestimated in terms of the business case to see now what are win-win scenarios in the future, and can we develop new kinds of products that smallholder farmers can produce, and we then as a company can market here in the UK. So that gave rise then to the project called Adaptation for Smallholders to Climate Change, ADAPT-CC, which we also, I think, recognized from the start that we have to have a collaborative approach. We can't tackle that ourselves as a company, but actually to have to cooperate with someone who has links to developing countries, who has knowledge on the ground, who has a wide network capability. And so we linked up with the German Technical Corporation, now called German International Corporation, GIZ, and to, in a public-private partnership, and to really, look into, so what can you bring to the table in terms of driving that project in terms of that smallholders have access to adaptation strategies. They actually have knowledge and understanding about what's happening, and access then to technical and financial resources to be able to put into practice and to implement these adaptation strategies that were locally defined in their communities in first place. There was a very interesting approach in terms of, well, why would a company engage on something like adaptation? And for GTZ, a little bit, what's actually the point to look into adaptation for smallholders might not be actually that straightforward. And we had long discussions at the beginning to make it actually happen, where you, in public-private partnerships, I think very often see that enormous imbalance between risk-taking and long and short-term approaches. Whilst I think companies, private sector is always much more risk-prone and just, well, let's try that, let's jump into that, let's find out, and we don't need all the answers beforehand. The public sector very often wants all the answers beforehand, before deciding actually to go ahead. So quite interesting dynamics between private and public sectors. Now the first step, as I said, was really about understanding, so that smallholder farmers engage with you around a topic and take it on and change something. Well, definitely they have to understand it. I don't know who is working with smallholder communities in developing countries. Anyone working with? All right, a couple of. So you know about the challenge, because it's very clear for smallholder farmers, their livelihood is at stake. So if you want that they change, well, you have to be very convincing, and rightly so, because if you induce them into changing their practices, or even look into diversification, well, their livelihood is at stake, and they have to be convinced. So how do you do that? So of course, with smallholder farmers, you use very visual methods And there's just an example from Nicaragua where you let smallholder farmers actually just draw and express themselves what they see as the challenge, where they want to be. And you see, I think, which is a great example of just a scenario building in how they see themselves on the left-hand side right now. So it's more or less a sustainable farming environment. But with the impact they sense now and without doing anything, well, in 2019, it doesn't look that great. And I think it's the expression that farmers and their organizations give to that is always quite amazing. And the ones of you who speak Spanish even can then detect a little bit. They get a little bit. There was a bit choking there because from Nicaragua, the country, to Nicaragua. Is quite funny because it's not that funny because it means diplomatically translated go to hell. That's what's gonna that we wanna have in 20 years time if we don't do anything. But again, at least they can still laugh about it as well. So once you go from an understanding point of view, then it's really what are the location-specific adaptation strategies for these communities. And again, back just to northern Peru and the scenario of coffee production there. But definitely, in some areas you have to look into management practices. So they can fertilize in a different way. They can protect the soil in a different way, and overall improve their practices. So that's sort of more of the easier adaptation strategies that farmers can adopt in first place. Of course, it gets a little bit more difficult and challenging if you look really into diversification. When, from a scenario like this, you say, well, actually in 20, 30, 40 years' time, it might not be possible to grow high-quality coffee where you are located in your community. So to introduce diversification is an adaptation strategy that communities should look into, but of course, very often they won't choose that as their priority strategy because it's, again, very high risk to move into a different crop. But depending on the level of impact that the communities already feel from climate change, so that their current tea crop or coffee crop is not good or is changing dramatically, then the diversification option and strategy is actually much stronger for them. And I will share some examples then with you on the next slide. And a third big arena of adaptation strategies around, well, there are, of course, then also new opportunities, meaning geographical areas that so far are not able to grow coffee, that might, in 20, 30 years' time, actually quite interesting to grow coffee. But there, you have to bring in the sustainability, the overall sustainability debate again, because taking, for example, here northern Peru, these are, of course, the higher altitude mountainous areas where you should actually not move into with export crops, because already the fragile ecosystems are quite challenging already. And so if you move export crops into these pristine landscapes in the future, well, it might be an adaptation strategy for these communities, but they're not sustainable because overall you actually jeopardize the ecosystems even more. So one of the adaptation strategies which I think were quite innovative and quite interesting in Peru was to explore the whole link of adaptation to the voluntary carbon market. So to see really how producer organizations can have a sustainable financing over time, so they don't depend on just aid projects or aid donations, but how they can generate their own income for adaptation strategies. So in that case of northern Peru, within the coffee farmers, there was no big potential for mitigation projects, because the ones familiar with coffee growing know well, in Latin America it's predominantly under shade tree management, smallholder farmers with 1, 2, 3 hectare maximum of land. So how on earth are you going to create actually a bigger mitigation project? Almost impossible. So what happened there in northern Peru, that communities up in the Andes Mountains, completely deforested for centuries, linked up with the lower lying coffee communities to create a reforestation project up in the mountains, but part of the revenues of that carbon credit project is used for the coffee adaptation activities. Again, a quite interesting link between different communities and creating a win-win situation, because in the end, it's the overall geographical area where you get really interesting ideas.